Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Séverine Autesserre on Peaceland, conflict resolution and the everyday politics of international intervention. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And it's our pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studio to talk about some important topic on the international agenda. And today it's my very great pleasure to welcome Séverine Autesserre, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Barnard College in Columbia University, and the author of a new book called Peaceland, the conflict resolution and the everyday politics of international intervention. So welcome, Séverine.
Well, thank you, David, for having me.
It's our great pleasure. Your book is a fascinating study of peace building because it's so different from all of the other ones. It's a very micro-level, bottom-up examination of how peace builders do their job and how the way in which they do it gets in the way of doing their job. So it's a fascinating story, and glad that you could come in and help us explore it. Let's start with the title, if that's all right with you. Peaceland, what is that? What do you mean by that? And how do you use that concept to get into this question?
So Peaceland, it's a metaphor. Peaceland is the word of the expatriates. So it's the word of the people who go from conflict zone to conflict zones with the intention to help different places build peace. And so it's a world where you have donors, diplomats, United Nations peacekeepers, other United Nations staff members, where you have people working for various non-governmental organizations, various international non-governmental organizations. And Peaceland really describe this world and the specific way of working of this world, and the fact that it has its own practice, its own time, economics, narratives, stories, the things that people believe, the things that they don't believe in, the things that they like, the values, and the things that they dislike. The whole book is looking at this world as this specific world with its specific way of working and trying to understand how the ways of working in this world, the very specific things that constitute this world, how it actually influence the results of international peace building. And I show that many of the practices, stories, habits, routines that the inhabitant of Peaceland have, all of these things actually decrease peace building effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. And what would some examples be, just very nitty-gritty, day-to-day examples of the content of Peaceland and how it might bear on the work they do?
Right. Well, there are 350 pages of that in the book. So it can be anything. Can be who you decide to socialize with after work. Who do you want to go and have a drink with? Do you want to have a drink with other expatriates, with other interveners, other foreigners, which is what most Peacelanders do? Or do you want to go and have a drink with local people, with the person who was your local counterpart, or with the person with whom you had a meeting during the day? How do you ensure your security when you feel unsafe? Do you live in a bunker? Do you put high walls and barbed wires in front of your house? Or do you try to integrate in the surrounding communities and to try to talk with different armed groups so that they will help you ensure your security? It's everything. Is what kind of knowledge do you think is the most important for building peace? Do you think it's thematic expertise, knowing about conflict resolution in general, knowing about how to organize elections, how to conduct cross-cultural negotiations, how to recruit people, and so on and so forth? Or do you think that it's local knowledge? It's the understanding of local conditions, the understanding of what's going on in a specific village or in a specific country. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples like that. What do you spend your time doing on an everyday basis when you arrive in the office? Or when you leave the office, do you spend your time writing reports? Or do you spend your time actually trying to go outside? How do you do publicity for your projects? Do you try to claim ownership for your project and to put your stamp on it and to say, this is my organization and this is my project? Or do you try to remain low profile And if there are positive results, do you try to claim the positive results, or do you try to say, well, no, it was mostly the people who were involved who did that? So it's basically everything, how you approach your work on an everyday basis. That's really the content of the book, and that's really the things that influence, again, whether your peace building initiative will have a higher chance of success or not.
Now, one of the things I found fascinating about your book was, of course, peace builders come from all over the world, and often you get people from different cultures and countries coming together on missions.
Yeah.
Lo and behold, Peaceland has its own culture, and it's relatively easy for these people from all over the planet to integrate and absorb and act out and perpetuate this Peaceland culture. And at the same time, as you make clear in your book, everybody recognizes that that's not a good thing.
Exactly.
So why does it keep happening?
Well, that's the thing. That's what's fascinating, is that what I document in the book is things that when I was an interviewer myself, when I worked in Afghanistan, in Congo, in Kosovo, I knew it was wrong to do that. I knew, for example, when I was in Afghanistan and I was going out to parties, like really wild parties with other interveners, and people were drinking alcohol and they were blowing off steam, I was feeling very uncomfortable in these parties because I knew they were shocking for our Afghan counterparts and our Afghan colleagues. And so I knew I was doing something wrong, but at the same time, and many people who follow the standard practice and the ways of working that I analyze in the book, many of them feel uncomfortable with the way things work. But the thing is that this is the solution that people have found to resolve the problem, the difficulties of working on the ground in conflict zones. Because you have to imagine what it is to work in a conflict zone. When you're a foreigner, you have no family life, you're in fear for your life very often, you lack basic facilities, your job is emotionally draining. Sometimes you feel that you're responsible for the life of dozens, if not thousands of people. So it's a really, really tough job, and people have found ways to deal with the difficulties. And for example, the fact of going and having a drink afterwards with other interveners, other expatriates, other international peace builders, yes, it doesn't help integrating the local population, it doesn't show respect for local populations, but at the same time, when you're exhausted, you want to meet with people who understand what you're going through. You want to meet with people who have been through the same thing, and you can just let down everything and think about something else. Or when you're afraid and you've been told many times that the best way to protect yourself is to isolate yourself from your surrounding and to put big walls behind you and other people, of course you want to feel safe. And of course you're going to isolate yourself from your surrounding. So everything is because it's an everyday response to the way things work, to the difficulties of working on the ground in conflict zones. But it's just a sum of daily decisions that people think they don't matter. They are uncomfortable with it, but the really important point is that they're uncomfortable, but they really don't think that it's going to matter for whether or not they're going to be successful in their work. Because the usual way of thinking about peace building is that we always think, what influences the effectiveness of peace building is what happens at the macro level. It's what happens in capital cities, in headquarters. It's negotiations at the United Nations Security Council. It's whether France and the United States and China are going to get together or not and agree on a topic or not. Or it's whether the leaders of different countries that are fighting are going to get together, or the leaders of rebel groups and government are going to get together. And so when you're a peace builder on the ground, you don't think that what you do after work and who you hang out with and how you talk to your local colleagues and what kind of book you pick up at night when you want to read, and what you do with your free time and what you eat, and all of these things. It really seems like mundane things that don't matter and that are not as important as the big national, international politics events. But what I'm really showing in the book is that these mundane decisions, they actually matter a lot.
Because it helps the locals trust the interveners or engage the interveners?
Because it helps, because they help or don't help interveners understand what's going on. and therefore design projects that are adapted to local conditions or not, because it helps local people feel that they are respected by international interveners or not, because it helps local people feel in control of international programs or not, and because it helps also create a sense of we're working together toward the same goals versus these foreigners are coming here and they're imposing what they think is best, but they don't know anything about my country because they didn't even bother to learn anything about the history and the culture before coming there.
Right. Now, there are examples in your book of people who actually managed to avoid some of the pathologies of Peaceland. What are some examples of that? And what made it possible for those people to do those things when, as you note, the pressures to sort of, retreat into the familiar must be overwhelming in most cases?
Well, the pressure is overwhelming, and that's why the exceptions are so few. So there are exceptions in the book, and they're really important. I'm so glad we're talking about them, because to me, they are the most important part of the book, because they are the way forwards. They are the things that actually are working in peace building and the models that we can follow when we think about having better peace building practice and better peace building ways of working. So I haven't found yet an organization that is an exception to everything that I describe. So I've found organizations that are exceptions to some of the patterns, some of the negative patterns, like, for example, valuing thematic knowledge over local expertise, or ensuring your security by living in bunkers versus being accepted by local populations and local armed groups. So I've found examples like that, and I always give the example of the Life and Peace Institute in Congo, because I think they do a fascinating job and a very important work, but there are many other organizations in Congo, in Timor, and even sometimes it's not the entire organization, it's a unit within an organization, or it's an individual within an organization who's really trying to change things. So for example, a story that I like a lot is a story of one of the people I interviewed. He was called James, and he lived in Timor-Leste, and he was working for an organization that was not paying him as much as he wanted and as much as other expatriates were paid. And so during weekend, he couldn't go to the beach or to spend a weekend outside of Dili, of the capital cities. So he had to stay in Dili, and what he did is that he started hanging out in the backyard of his neighbors, because that was the only social thing to do, the only fun thing to do. So he was hanging out with his neighbors, hanging out in their backyard, and eventually he learned the local language, because otherwise you get really bored. And so he learned the local language, and also he started being part of the fabric. And Timorese people accepted him and saw him as someone who was not a threat, and someone whom they didn't have to be careful about. And so they started speaking, when he was here, speaking in ways that they never spoke about. They never spoke in front of other expatriates. So they were saying things in front of him that they never said in front of other expatriates. And in Timor, I don't know if you remember, but in between 2000 and 2006, you had a big peace process, and everybody thought that it was going fantastically well. And then in 2006, you had big riots, and the riots took everybody by surprise. Everybody but a few people. And James was one of the few interveners, the few foreigners who had seen the deterioration of the situation. He had predicted that problems were about to erupt, and he had tried to convince other foreigners to change their way of working and to prevent the crisis. And there were a few other people like that. And the main difference between these people who had seen the problems and who had tried to do the right thing and the others were not that they were better trained or necessarily more intelligent. It's just that they had the local context, they had the local understanding. People trusted them and spoke in front of them about problems that they hid from other expatriates.
And was James able to take that local knowledge and make it work for the mission in the office, in the field, with his colleagues in the expatriate community?
Well, from what I understand, he was able to try to advocate for different measures, and it's like, everybody, all of the exceptions that I've seen where it's only an individual, they face a lot of pressure. Because there is a huge pressure to conform. And going back to the question that you asked me before, what makes certain people or certain organizations be an exception while the pressure to conform is so high? It's actually, so I have a very theoretical argument about that, which builds on psychology, the difference between the I and the me, the social role of the me. And anyway, what's important is that you have mainly two factors. The first one is whether there is a reason for you to think of yourself in novel ways. So for example, whether when you arrive in a situation, you can handle the situation by conforming to the social roles that you want to do. So for example, you're a good expatriate, so you close your doors and you close your windows when you're driving, and you live in a compound and you interact with other foreigners, and you believe that thematic expertise is what really matters for peace building. So whether by doing these social things you can do what's expected of you, or whether there is some kind of problem for you, of disjunction between what you want to do and what you believe in, and the things that you have to do. And when there is this disconnection between what's socially expected of you and what you personally believe in, that's when you start of trying to see if you can challenge the social norms. So that's the first thing. And the other thing is that the cost of breaking the social role shouldn't be more important than the reward. And that's where it gets complicated, because for many people the cost of breaking the social roles in peace building are very high. If you don't respect the security rules, you're going to get fired. If you if you start advocating for local knowledge but you're a thematic expert, you're going to lose your job. And so there are many sanctions, and sanctions for breaking social roles, but at the same time, the reward, what you get, is not that high. Because personally, you won't benefit much as an international peace builders from the fact that local people are more integrated. You're going to have, a reward for doing the good thing, and you're going to feel better. But otherwise, you're not going to have immediate rewards for you. So the sanctions are high, the rewards are low, and that explains why the exceptions are so few.
Mm-hmm. Now, how important is context? I could be wrong, but my impression was that Timor-Leste was not actually very dangerous between 2000 and 2006, and so you could go hang out in your neighbor's backyard, but could you do that in Kandahar province in Afghanistan?
Actually, I have a friend who's doing that.
Oh, really?
Yes, she's a researcher, and she's a woman. But yes, it is possible. It is possible in every single country where I've been, and I've worked in places going from Afghanistan to Congo to South Sudan, Timor-Leste, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, and Cyprus. So places that are extremely dangerous and places that are quite safe. And in all places, you have the possibility of going and hanging out in your neighbor's backyard. And when I was in Afghanistan, I was invited to do these kind of things, but I was feeling some kind of barrier and constraint that I couldn't go too far with that, because I had to maintain some distance. I didn't want to be perceived as partial. I didn't want to be perceived as someone who was taking sides, who was going native. But there are people who do that, and it's actually one of the best ways to ensure your security. Isolating yourself from the context and living in a compound is actually a worse way of promoting your security than trying to blend in the population and hang out in the backyard of your neighbor and hang out with armed groups, and talk with people and make sure that they all understand what you're doing and that they all accept what you are doing. And there have been research that have proven that. So it's not me
Well, it's
just
counterintuitive,
saying.
but I believe you.
Yeah.
Now, what is unique about peace building here? It sounds like this would be a dynamic that would also affect development operations, NGO operations, maybe even foreign business operations.
Yes. Well, there is nothing specific about peace building in that. I focus on peace building because that's what I care about. I want to help make peace building better, and I want to help build peace in places that are devastated by violence. But there are researchers who have done fantastic work and shown similar things on development, on humanitarian aid, on democratization efforts. And then since I've started presenting the book, I had businessmen telling me, or business people telling me that the dynamics were exactly the same in terms of the positive and the negative, in terms of what doesn't work and what I say could work. I've had counterinsurgency officials tell me the same things. I have diplomats working not in conflict zones tell me the same things. So it seems that it's, and I've also even had people who work with communities inside Canada tell me that it resonates as well with them. So I'm making an argument about international peace building because that's what I wanted to help improve. But from everything I've heard thus far, it has implications much broader than international peace building.
Right. Now, you do have quite a list of policy recommendations.
I do.
In the book. What are some of the most important of those? And when you brief those to the organizations that run peace building operations, primarily the UN, what kind of reaction do you get, and do you notice any movement in the direction of uptake?
Right. So the policy recommendations, the most important, well, there are so many. I have 20 pages of that in the book, so it's difficult to choose. They're all my favorite. It's difficult to choose. I would say probably the importance of I've been talking about how we value thematic and technical knowledge so much more than understanding of local context, and so I think one of my most important recommendations is that we need to rebalance that. So we don't need to put everything into now value local knowledge of local context much more than thematic knowledge, but we need to have a balance between the two, which we don't have now. So that's an important thing, and so concretely that means hiring people who have already an understanding of local context, like anthropologists, historians, if you're thinking about international interveners, and also giving much more responsibility to local people in the design and planning of international efforts, and not only in the implementation. So that's really important. And then I have plenty of others, but I think the one about security is one of my favorite because it's one that could have potentially huge implications in terms of helping make sure that people who are devoting their lives to trying to help others actually don't get killed for that. So I think that's pretty important. So ensuring your security by being accepted, using the acceptance approach to security, as we say, so being accepted by armed groups and by local populations instead of isolating yourself in your compound, and remaining low profile. Stop being so arrogant, and stop putting your sticker on everything you do, and stop always claiming that you are behind the peace process, the initiative, the peace agreement, anything, but rather take the backseat as an intervener and let local people shine, because that helps a lot. It's a very minor thing, but that helps a lot make the peace agreement or whatever you're trying to do permanent, because people think that they're the owner, it's their responsibility, and therefore they will try to perpetuate it, rather than if as a foreign entity you claim that it's yours, then the beneficiaries or the stakeholder won't take responsibility for it, and they might even resent the initiatives. But I have plenty of others.
And what do they say in New York when you brief this?
Well, thus far they've been super kind, which I didn't expect. Everybody told me that when I published the book, it would be a big splash, and people would get really, really upset, and they haven't. And everything I've heard thus far in New York or in Paris or in London or in Nairobi when I'm presenting the finding is, oh great, we're so glad you're saying it. We've been thinking that, and we're so glad someone is finally saying it. So I hear a lot of agreement, but your other question was, do you see any changes? And I don't. So that's the thing, is that we need to go from the agreement to actually putting things in practice.
I mean, things like not flying your flag all over the place, that sounds pretty easy.
It does, but on the other hand, it needs to be a concerted decision among many different international actors. Because if you're the only organization not flying your flag all over the place, then local populations will wonder what is this organization that is there pretending to work but actually does nothing, because they don't see what you're doing. And then the host government will have the same reaction, like, but what are you doing? And it's happened again in Timor-Leste, where I think it was the Australian aid decided that they would remain low profile at a point, and that they would avoid advertising their actions. And there was backlash from local populations and from the host government saying, but all of the others, we see what they're doing, and you, what are you doing? And the Australians were like, well, we're doing just as much. It's just that we're being discreet about that. So it needs to be a concerted decision, and also for populations at home, so donor populations in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. Thus for the donors, they tell me a lot, well, we need to put our flags and our stickers and to claim everything we do, because we want to show domestic populations that we're doing something with their money. We need to show taxpayers how we're using their dollars. And taxpayers need to stop expecting to see their flag everywhere. So it's much more complicated than just saying, well, let's remove the flag and be happy about that.
Now, are there many examples of missions at any scale in which local people are in fact in charge and the expatriates are answering to them?
Very few. There are very few. The one example I found, which I thought was fascinating, was the Eastern Congo Initiative. So it's an initiative that was created by Ben Affleck. Yes, and what they did is that they sent an expatriate on the ground. She knew Eastern Congo very well already, and she had been there she was engaged to a local Congolese, so she spoke the local language. She knew things, and for a year she was just trying to learn about the local context and what the Eastern Congo Initiative could do. And her job at a point was to recruit the director, a Congolese director, for the mission in Congo. And I thought that was a fantastic way of doing things. First, do not rush in thinking that you have the answer, but rather try to think, to look at what's going on and ask people on the ground what they need. And second, hire someone who's actually from the area and who's the best possible. They took months to find the person, but who's the best possible person you can find. But make sure that, yes, you're going to have a technical expert, you're going to have foreign interveners who bring their comparative advantage, who bring the expertise that they have from abroad, and that's local people tell me is very important. But also make sure that you have as many leaders who are from the area, who are from the country, and who can bring the understanding of local conditions.
And has there been enough time to have a good impact assessment of that particular project and that particular
They've done a few projects that were fascinating. They've not done a mapping of local non-governmental organizations in different provinces. That I think is the best database that we have of organizations working in different sectors in Congo, and that's a very useful database, so that when people like you and I, or donors, when we think about who we want to support in Congo, we can go and look at this database of organization and see what they're doing, who's leading them, how reliable, because it's only reliable existing organization doing good work that are listed in this database, for example. So I think it's a very helpful project, and they've done a couple of other things like that nobody had done, and it just makes everybody's work much easier.
Right. Last question. We at CIGI are interested in governance innovation, and so I'm wondering if you think the challenges and the problems you've identified are ones that have governance solutions, or at least novel governance solutions, or is it just a question of taking the existing actors and the existing institutions and convincing them to do their job differently? Do we need to reinvent anything from a bird's eye view governance perspective here?
I don't think you need to reinvent anything. You can work with existing institutions. You can also change the institutions. It's not what matters. To me, governance innovations is something you do at the macro level. And what I'm saying is that no matter what you do at the macro level, if you change your everyday practices on the ground and your everyday ways of working on the ground, then it's going to help whatever institutions you have at the macro level.
Very good. Well, I hope there is uptake. I hope people do listen.
Thank
It's
you.
a fascinating book. I highly recommend it to our audience. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today to explore Peaceland. And please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Séverine Autesserre on Peaceland, conflict resolution and the everyday politics of international intervention. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And it's our pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studio to talk about some important topic on the international agenda. And today it's my very great pleasure to welcome Séverine Autesserre, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Barnard College in Columbia University, and the author of a new book called Peaceland, the conflict resolution and the everyday politics of international intervention. So welcome, Séverine.
Well, thank you, David, for having me.
It's our great pleasure. Your book is a fascinating study of peace building because it's so different from all of the other ones.
And so it's a world where you have donors, diplomats, United Nations peacekeepers, other United Nations staff members, where you have people working for various non-governmental organizations, various international non-governmental organizations. And Peaceland really describe this world and the specific way of working of this world, and the fact that it has its own practice, its own time, economics, narratives, stories, the thing that people believe, the things that they don't believe in, the thing that they like, the values, and the thing that they dislike. The whole book is looking at this world as this specific world with its specific way of working and trying to understand how the ways of working in this world, the very specific things that constitute this world, how it actually influence the results of international peace building. And I show that many of the practices, stories, habits, routines that the inhabitant of Peaceland have, all of these things actually decrease peace building effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. And what would some examples be, just very nitty-gritty, day-to-day examples of the content of Peaceland and how it might bear on the work they do?
Right, well,
it's a very micro-level, bottom-up examination of how peace builders do their job and how the way in which they do it gets in the way of doing their job. So it's a fascinating story, and glad that you could come in and help us explore it. Let's start with the title, if that's all right with you. Peaceland. What is that? What do you mean by that? And how do you use that concept to get into this question?
So Peaceland, it's a metaphor. Peaceland is the word of the expatriates. So it's the word of the people who go from conflict zone to conflict zones with the intention to help different places build peace.